Chapter 9. The Raven's Shadow. Kermorven knew better than to linger in a place so exposed. He cast one quick glance around that blasted land, wrapping his cloak more tightly around him, and then ushered the others back into the mouth of the arch. "A poor return for all your perseverance," he said darkly. "I should have known the hill would be immured in the ice." He made as if to strike his fist upon the stone, but Ilse intercepted it and drew it gently down. "Still too full of yourself," she said, but her tone was unusually mild. "Where else was there to go?" Kermorven shook his head wearily. "Nowhere, I suppose. I hoped that the open air meant the ice might have missed this corner of the city. Idle hope. Why should it?" Rock raised an eyebrow.
"Well, how'd that building escape? The one beneath the rock fall?"
"Perhaps because it was beyond the walls. A guardhouse on the road outside the southern gates, maybe. That would explain the strength of its building, and the secret stair, a retreat into or out of the walls." "But did it escape?" Elof asked. "Where did the rockfall come from? We never did climb it to find out, remember? The Raven saw to it that we would find the chamber first. Ilse, the elder folk are wise in the ways of the ice. What halted the spearhead it sent out to destroy Morven? Why did it not strike further south yet?" Ilse thought a moment. "It was not halted, not as such. The ice is forever advancing, fed by snow and rime nearer its center. As it moves into the warmer south, though, the outermost rim begins to melt, and so extends no further. But neither does it retreat, being replenished by the ice coming from behind. Its masters must have concentrated that renewing force in one narrow area, to drive the ice further south than it would otherwise have gone. For at the point where the climb balances the advance against the melting, there the ice appears to halt. But in truth, it never does. That is why, when a great enough cold comes, it can advance so suddenly, it simply ceases to melt." Elof nodded. "And in that melting, what would happen to those?" He gestured out at the frozen waves of moraines. Great mountain weights of shattered stone, borne along in waves by the ice to spread ruin and mayhem at its foot. That is what the rockfall was, without knowing if we stood then in the very shadow of the southernmost ice. "As well we did not know," said Kermorven, "or we would hardly have dared venture down those stairs." His hand strayed to his pack then, and his smile was as bleak as the world outside. "Though I cannot complain, can I? It is you others I worry for." Elof found it in himself to smile. "We struggle in the same net, do we not? But console yourself. If this hill was in the south of Kermorven the city, we cannot be far from the margins of the ice. We should be able to cross it, as you and I have done." "But not by night," said Ilse with a shudder. "No, indeed," agreed Kermorven feelingly. "I have had enough of that little game, and Elof also, I do not doubt. Which means we must contrive to rest here till dawn as best we can, and without freezing to death. Ilse, how many torchlights remain?" She rummaged in her pack. 9, no, 11. And those 2 half-burnt in the holders." "Then we will build a fire of them, the burning ones, and 2 more to begin. But not up here where the light can be seen. It must be further down the steps."
"Ah, well,"
said Rock lugubriously.
"Perhaps the smoke will clear enough of the stench. The brute is slain, but it has its vengeance yet."
By common consent, they ate their meager fare in the cleaner chill of the archway before they built their fire. It burned bright, but gave them scarce warmth enough to balance what the cold stones sucked out through their cloaks as they sought some comfortable position to sleep in, huddled together on the narrow stairs. "Here of all places we should set a watch," said Kermorven painfully. "I will take the first span of the night." "No, I," sighed Elof. "The nearness of the ice makes me restless, weary as I am. I shall sleep the better for growing used to it." "As you will. I am past all argument." The warrior pulled his hood over his face and pillowed his head on his arm. Rock and Ills were already asleep. Elof felt suddenly dreadfully alone. He warmed his hands once more at the meager blaze, rose, and clambered out into the archway and the ice glow. 2 nights without sleep, as he reckoned it, and with only a little food, had made him weaker than he realized. His legs wobbled beneath him, and a deep ache burned in his bones. At least that would help him keep awake, and should grow less as he sat a while. But time passed, and it did not. Indeed, it worsened a little, or he felt it more clearly, and found in it a shade of the pain his first steps on the living ice had cost him. High up over the curve of the world glided a cold sliver of moon, like the sail of some unseen bark. Even to that faint radiance the ice awoke, and Elof, who had been sitting numb and heedless in misery, sat up with a gasp. A greater spectacle it was than ever he had seen before, even in the Northlands. Here there were no mountains to hedge in that dazzling desolation, few outcroppings above it save this. The ice shone out clear, unbroken, boundless from one edge of the world to the other and beyond, one vast sweeping sea of shimmering splendor, one enormous jewel that made the petty majesties of men seem minute, transient. But even as that feeling came to him, he thought back upon Morven, upon the mighty dead of Dorgal Arlanen, and he cast it back, rejecting it utterly. Small wonder that the ice provoked such thoughts. They were enshrined in it, spawned by the minds that made it. But slight and flawed as living things might be, at least they lived. They grew, they strove, and in their several ways they loved. And all those things men did, and had minds also. They could love the diverse riches of life, but still savor this sterile glory. Theirs was the world in both its aspects, and by that much were the kindred of men richer, stronger, greater than those rebel powers. Looking out over this, the embodiment of their narrowed vision, he almost found it in himself to pity them. As the moon climbed higher, he found that the ice grew tiring to watch, that his eyes seemed to be playing tricks upon him. Every so often in the distance northward, he would see a sheen or flicker of light, but whether in ice or sky, he could never be certain. It would play slowly across the brightness for a moment, then vanish and reappear somewhere else, sometimes nearer, sometimes more distant. It began to disturb him, and he reminded himself he should be watching every way. He stood up stiffly and, staying in the shadow of the arch, turned southward. To his surprise, in this clearer light, it looked as if the ice there did not extend quite so far, as if it might end before the horizon. But as he could see nothing beyond it but sky, he could not be sure. Then something in the distance flickered. He groaned, rubbed his eyes, and blinked. But when he looked again, he saw it still, and more distinctly. This was no trick of sight. It was on the ice and moving very fast, straight towards the hill. He turned to wake the others, but a sudden wailing wind ruffled his hair and plucked at his cloak, strongly enough in his weakened state to make him stumble. Then the shape was already, incredibly, almost at the hill's foot. And when he saw what it was, he stood in gaping amazement one moment too long. For the figure in the heavy mantle of midnight blue had already swung himself from the huge horse, and was striding up the rocky slope at as fierce a pace as if it were some trifling hummock. Elof gathered his wits. This time he would confront this weird wanderer. This time he would demand straight answers from this raven who pecked and plucked so lightly at his destiny. Grateful as he was for the good things done him, he had a right to be angered at the play that was made of him, as if he were only some mindless piece on a gaming board. He was not. He knew he was not. And before much longer, come what may, the raven would know it too. Elof ducked back into shadow, and as the heavy footfall passed, he stepped out with all the grace he could muster, his hand held out to greet and to command. As well might he have sought to bar the wind in its course. The mantled figure swept up unheeding, and only its shadow touched him. But that touch struck him dumb, appalled, terrified. As from heights unguessable it fell upon him, and for an instant the swirling mantle seemed a thunderhead of cloud cresting the summit of the hill, the staff taller than the tallest trees of Tapaiao. As immense as the powers carved on the corridors of Dorgal Arlanen, he saw that shape, a towering, shadowy vastness against the stars. Then it passed him by, and it was no taller than a tall man, but still its shadow swallowed up the arch, and Elof within it. He could only stand still and stare as the figure bestrode the hill crest, and brandished its staff as if to strike down the wheeling stars. He could only listen as it cried out in the same voice he had first heard upon the wind outside his marshland smithy. That rang out now above the gusts that wailed about the hilltop. Hearken, Lohi, Taunantar, hark! From deepest ice, heed my behest. I call you up, I summon you, from your bleak caves, from your stark caverns. Arise, Lohi! Lohi, mistress of ice, from shimmering stillness, rise to the heights. Strong songs compel you, hearken and answer. Wisdom within you, I would awake. Lohi, Lohi, lady of death, hearken and heed me, hear me and come. Silence fell as the song ended, fell like a blade. The breeze sank, the chill grew stronger, biting into Elof's trembling flesh. The tall figure stood unmoving as if it had taken root in the bare stone, its staff outthrust at the sky. But suddenly at the staff's head, wavering, crackling, sparking, a great column of green balefire burst out. Slowly the hooded head turned to the northwest. Elof followed its gaze and sank down, shivering. Intense, vivid, closer far, that shimmer he had seen coursed through the ice, and the whiteness darkened and grew transparent, as if melted all in a moment to a deep pool. And within that depth stars awoke, mirroring the blazing skies overhead. Yet the stars above were still, while their images leaped suddenly, darted and swirled in the deeps like small fish around one single point of blue light that did not move. Brighter it waxed, broader, clearer it grew, until he saw in it a shape arising, floating upwards as one drowned. A woman's form, unclad, her limbs outstretched and drifting, her pale hair billowing about her in some unseen current. He could see her face clearly, waxen and still, the eyes closed, the pale lips unmoving. But from the depths sang a voice clear and fair that he could not easily forget. Strong calls the song, mighty the craft that should shield you. I do not sleep, and I am come, only to see who would dare. Deep-throated laughter echoed out across the ice. A wanderer am I, and craft I called on, to summon you far from your lair. A world-wide roamer, thinker, reflector, delver of wisdom, that lies at the roots of the world. Thus have I called you, that you may answer. Thus am I free from your will. The staff swung downward in his hand, and in the swirl of its passage, the green fire guttered into nothing. A black blade glittered in its place, that struck the stone of the hilltop into leaping, dazzling sparks. Elof blinked, and when his eyes opened, the ice stretched out unbroken, white and bleak as before. But another figure stood atop the hill. Slender and fair she was as the wanderer was massive, and very straight she stood, haughty pride in the angle of her head, in the blazing sapphire of her eyes. Exactly as last he had seen her, years past, did she look. Her pale, fine hair gathered back from her brow, but spilling in cascades about the shoulders of the soft white robes she wore, through which the starlight shone. And the quiet chime of her voice still set him a shiver, even with cool anger in its tone. You are not what you would seem. Why summon me thus? Have you sunk to the level of the witless things you shield, that you must don their shape to speak with me? The dark voice was calm. You are not what you wish to believe. For though you deem yourself a conqueror, lady, yet to your own impatience are you still a slave. I came to save you some trouble, that is all. To tell you where he is, that you most seek. To tell me, where then, Lord of Deceptions? The tall figure shifted his mantle a little, settling its shadow more thoroughly over the archway. Why, where you cannot see him, lady. So save yourself the trouble of searching, as you have done so frantically since you sensed his presence. He is free now, and will not easily be tamed again. Spring comes, even to Taonla, and that dark power declines. Your consort also can hinder him no more. The woman who was Louhi whirled sharply about, her eyes questing out across the southward ice, her full lips working in fury. She rounded on the tall figure. You, though you skulk among the heights and seek to shield your doings from my eyes, I know of them. Believe you me. You give him too much aid. He is no free champion, such as you must have, but only a shadow, a thrall, a powerless puppet of your will. The suspicion of a chuckle lay under the words that the wanderer gave in reply. What men have from me shall only balance what other powers set against them. So it is with him. At most, perhaps, I have shown him a few truths he might otherwise have come upon more slowly, perhaps not even in time, but he has had to earn them, and what use he makes of them is his affair entirely. When he was under the hand of the forest, could I help him, or you hinder? Yet he escaped. Without his free courage and that of his friends, none of this could have come about. Lady, it is you and yours, fettered in yourselves, who deal in thralls. Powers that are free, only free heroes can serve. The stamp of her foot split stone. So is it all over then, with the powers? What is left to you, or any of us? Why need you exist, if those who should serve you must be free to make sport and scorn of you at every turn of their feeble will? Lady, lady, will you always be what you were? Will you not learn as I had to, and thereby grow? Change and reshaping are the rule. They brought you into being as much as they did men, and that you cannot alter. Nor should you seek to restore what was, solely and selfishly because it pleased you. Deep in himself, even grim old Taoon knows that. Or why else should he seek to pretend he preserves the minds of men, when he is only snatching at their shadows, wearing the sum of their memories like a mask of dead skin? Louhi turned away angrily, still searching the ice. To Elof's astonished eyes, the falling moon seemed to settle behind her head like a jagged crown. "And what of Tapaiao?" she demanded, her voice taut and troubled. "He embraced life, yet even he abhors men, and seeks to subdue them." The mantled shoulders shrugged. "Once he escaped your error, only to fall into it again, as if life and men were separable. Sooner or later must life lead to mind, and in some form, just as your lifeless world had sooner or later to bear that life. Of us all, I among us, perhaps only Ilmarinen understood from the first. All things go their way appointed, and in their own time. Our hindrance or help may mean less than we think. So, there's more to come, but that you must find out for yourself." The mantle shook like a shifting hill. A gigantic cawing laughter echoed through the stillness, deriding its barren majesty, stripping away its pretensions with the merry warmth of a spring breeze. Louhi's face twisted in fury. A pale flame beat down upon the hill. A curtain of light, green and scarlet, flickered and lashed about the mantled shape. Then, like the echo of an angry cry, it sprang away northward and faded. Below its passage the ice heaved and shattered explosively, flinging bright shards, jagged as lightning, high into the empty sky. The wanderer stood alone upon the hill a moment, and then, without a glance at Elof, the tall figure turned and retraced his steps down the steep slope. Behind the hill's shoulder he vanished, and a moment later the great horse sprang away across the ice, westward after the sinking moon. Trembling, Elof lowered his brow to the cool stone, and when he lifted it again, though it seemed but a second, the stars were already paling in the eastern sky. On limbs first numbed, then aching, he heaved himself wearily up, brushing off gravel that had bitten into the flesh of his face, and hobbled down into the archway. There lay the others as he had left them, around a fire which had burned away unfed to a black stain upon the stone. Anxiously, he stared down, but at the first scrape of his foot there was a whirl of dark cloak, and Kermorven was on his feet. The warrior blinked at the faint gleam upon the wall above, and frowned. "What, man? Have you watched the night through?" Then he glanced from Elof's bruised cheek to the dead fire, and smiled wryly. Ah, you fell asleep, did you? A mercy you did not freeze, and we also. Well, we were all of us weary. It was more than that, bumbled Elof, as Rock and Ills began to yawn and stir. I scarcely know what I saw, whether it was a dream or...
Well, have a stab at telling,
yawned Rock.
while we rekindle the fire.
No, said Elof, though he yearned for the warmth and the comfort the fire gives. We dare waste no hour of day. We are hunted, and must be off the ice as soon as we can. Kermorven cast one swift look at him, and snatched up his pack. Then tell us on the way. We will climb down to the very edge of the ice, and at first light make what speed we can across it.
And what then?
Sighed Rock gloomily, as they plodded out onto the hillside.
Back into merry Townlaw?
Kermorven glanced at the graying sky. I cannot say, but I think you do not realize how much further east we were taken. I am hardly certain myself. Even the Duergar maps do not extend this far. But by the stars, we could be as far from where we fled the forest as that place was from the shield range. The others stared at him. That far? Asked Ills. Very possibly. Perhaps here town's dead hand will hold less sway. We can only hope. He set his face to the weather-scoured stone and began to clamber down the uncertain slope, the way the Wanderer had taken. We have some reason to hope, said Elof, and as they climbed, he told them of the meeting on the bare hilltop. You actually heard them talk? Marveled Ills. Talking as we do? I don't know what I heard, confessed Elof. Whether it was true speech or... I don't know. But the meaning? That I am sure of. Lohi took it as an insult that he addressed her in human form. But I am sure, somehow, that it was so I could hear and understand.
Couldn't it have all been just you dreaming, could it?
Rock asked.
Had some funny ones myself on an empty cut.
Elof smiled ruefully. Dream or vision or whatever, how can I tell? But something happened, of that I am sure. A search, an encounter, and that we were shielded, and she misled into thinking we had already quit the ice. Then he fell silent, gazing at the rubble beneath his feet. I am sure. See here in all this deathly waste. There and all the way downhill to the very edges of the ice, wherever there was a scrap of shelter among the barren soil, tiny stars of blue hue had sprung up. Where the Wanderer had trodden, the King's Hill was carpeted with flowers. Spring comes, said Elof, as he promised, even to this ruined place. It is not wholly conquered. Not yet, said Ills. Not yet. They rested for a few precious moments at the foot of the hill, watching light climb up behind the gray clouds eastward, and they ate the last of their provision to fortify themselves for the coming dash. Elof sat silent, for a thought had come to him in the middle of his tale, the memory of words he had hardly taken in. Kermorven, he said suddenly, if what you said is true, then this is about as far as we might have come, if we had had no hindrance. If we had been traveling for all those months we lingered in the forest. Kermorven frowned. You would say that he repaid the time the forest took from us. It could be, I suppose. Yes, as he cleared our way through the western forest, because Nyrad had forced us ashore too early. Ills nodded. What men have from me? That must be what he meant, mustn't it? Some of it, at any rate, said Kermorven thoughtfully. He may also have been warning us we could expect no more help for now. That was my thought also, said Elof.
Might be a relief, growled Rock. His brand of help's a whit hard to handle. I'd sooner fend for myself. Short of any more spooks at my shirt-tails, that is, he added hastily. I am inclined to agree with you, said Kermorven, very gravely. Given that small exception. They laughed, and it was as if that living sound was answered. Molten gold spilled suddenly across the rims of the charcoal clouds, and then burst between them as a river through a crumbling wall. Long beams lanced out across the lifeless landscape, playing over the curve of the hill as a hand might caress a cheek, warming and gladdening. And from the south came breeze that was not yet turned cutting and cold, and carried still some faint benison from warmer lands. Kermorven sprang up and threw back his cloak. That is our sign. Let us not waste a second of it. He strode out onto the ice, and Ills after him. Elof hesitated, and Rock watched him keenly. Something the matter? Elof stretched out a foot, like a hesitant swimmer, half believing he would have grown immune to the pain by now. At the first touch of the ice, agony lanced up his leg, and he stumbled. Rock ran to help, but Elof shook him off and staggered on, probing within himself for the source of that pain as a surgeon might search for a wound. Like a thin blade, it flickered and stabbed at him, striking in one place and then another as he sought to guard it. He was like a swordsman set against an opponent who could toy with him, as Kermorven once had. But against it, as against Kermorven, he set the smith's strength in him, and looked through the pain, past it, as he might look past the sting of forge sparks in the finishing of some fine work. When Ills and Kermorven looked back in concern, he stiffened his back, swung his pack about him casually, and even managed to force a smile. He was not alone in his troubles. The rising sun struck fierce reflections off the ice, light that seared streaks of color across their sight, and troubled Ills worst of all. She pulled her hood low to shadow her eyes, but ere long she was all but blind. Her folk, as she remembered, were accustomed to wear a kind of visor or eye mask with thin slits when they crossed such bright places. But they had none, nor anything to make one save a thin silken scarf. With that bound about her eyes, she could see enough to guide her own steps. Despite all, though, they made better time than they had feared, for the ice proved less arduous than they remembered. Here at its southern border, it did not press hard up against a mountain wall, as in the north. It lay thinner upon the land, and the moraines and crevasses were further apart, shallower and more eroded, easier to cross and climb. The spring sun gave the travelers warmth and softened the glassy, compacted snow of the glacier's surface, but not to deep, dangerous slush, as it would in the brief days of high summer. They had meltwater to drink, flowing by them in fast rills and streamlets, though they had to warm it in their flasks a while. None the less, it was a wearying land to cross, and Elof and Ills could hardly enjoy even the scant rest Kermorven allowed them. At length, as the sun fell away into afternoon, he called out and pointed. The white wastes ahead had suddenly ceased to seem infinite. At the boundary between bright ice and sullen sky, a thread of darkness had appeared, thin and wavering, and with even a few steps forward it thickened and grew more distant. Distinct. "Land!" cried Rock. "Open land! That's the end of the ice!" Elof had to fight down the urge to run. In his excitement, he lost the reins of his pain, and felt it all the more keenly anew. They could not hurry, as it turned out, for even with the scarf across her eyes, Ilse's sight was failing rapidly, and she could scarcely keep up their former pace. It was some hours before they came to their goal. All this time the land opened out before them. At first they saw only a flat country, dark and indistinct, spattered and threaded here and there with gleaming surfaces, snow or water or mire, there was no telling which. It seemed all too like the heart of Taonla to the west, though still infinitely more inviting than the ice. But as they drew nearer the rim of the glaciers, they saw the first distant signs of the transformation the changing seasons would bring. Plaintive cries echoed down the wind. Arrows of gray geese beat across the glistening clouds, settling in great flocks upon the bright water southward. But no nearer, Kermorven sighed hungrily. So close to the rim the meltwaters must be too cold. Still, we may find hardier creatures to hunt. On now, to the end. But when at last they neared the margins of the surface ice, they halted in bafflement and dismay. Thin though the ice was, its shattered margin stood still a tower and fortress above the lands. Beneath their feet it fell away in an unclimbable precipice. Its few breaches led down to perilous-looking slopes of snow-clad rocks and screes such as the raven had set them down in. Elof tipped down a small stone, and almost at once they had the doubtful pleasure of seeing a whole segment of the slope go bounding and thundering away into shadow. Silently they looked at one another, and at the rapidly sinking sun, and turned to search elsewhere. Strangely enough, it was Ilse, blinded as she was, who found their way down. As they passed across a wide promontory in the cliffs, she exclaimed that the ice sounded hollower beneath her feet, and then that she could hear running water echoing up from beneath. She insisted they follow it. The sound of the water led them some little way along the cliff to the edge of a deep fissure, almost invisible from the ice behind, and when they peered over, they knew they had found their climb. It was as if some great worm had gone burrowing through the ice, leaving behind it a wide, round tunnel with sides as smooth as green glass, which now spilled a small stream out into the fissure. This had evidently once been part of the tunnel, but had worn so wide that the roof had collapsed. Now the floor was eaten away into a fantastic labyrinthine set of falls that wove away down the steep slope toward its shadowy foot, and made a passable stair. But what did the eating? Puzzled Rock, as they lowered themselves gingerly down the glassy surface. He had elected to take the lead, to hammer out handholds with his mace. Not that piddling little trickle, surely. Hardly, said Elof, forgetting the new pain each handhold cost him as he gazed in deep wonder at the weird, fluted shapes in the cleft, columns and stairs and baths through which the brown streamlet leaped and chuckled like some merry child, mocking greater waterfalls. If this much water comes through in the first days of sun, it must be a great cascade by high summer. You don't know the half of it, young human, said Ilse wryly from above his head. So much ice melts that the sheer weight of its flow can drive tunnels like these uphill, or dam up behind rockfalls and send them spilling out across the land ahead, to shatter and flood and finally to freeze. But to the glacier, that much water's nothing, less than the sweat on our brows. To the ice as a whole, it's less still, because as much or more will come back in the winter as rime and snow. 3 great rivers we've seen since we left my mountains, and it's the meltwater that feeds them all. Kermorven, who was guiding her down, shook his head in dismayed wonder. We know too little of this. If the last kings of Morven had had the counsel of the Duergar, they would not have reckoned too little of the menace of the ice, and so saved more from the ruin. Great evil indeed has come from the sundering of our folk. From the sundering of all kindreds, said Elof thoughtfully. The elder folk from the younger, north from south, dying Morven from newborn Bryhane, the powers, even, from men. Wisdom is not passed on and must be bought anew, and ever more dearly. There speaks as true a wisdom as any, said Ilse forcefully. But who shall bring it to an end? Who, indeed, said Elof, guiding Ilse across from one steep ice wall to another, and becoming thoroughly entangled as he sought to lead her limbs to rock's footholds. Well, that is hardly the way, she protested darkly. Have a care where you lay your hands. Rock and Kermorven chuckled. Bear up, said Rock, clambering down onto the rim of an ice basin. He peered over the edge and added, If you'll forgive the words, there's not so far to go now. All the more reason to make haste, said Kermorven, swinging himself after Ilse. So they slipped and scrambled down the last stages of the fall, only to find that its foot tumbled down over an ice-sheathed boulder in which Rock could cut no proper holds. Bracing himself, Elof pressed flat to the ice and fought to keep his limbs steady as its bitter flame burned into him and knotted his muscles. He climbed jerkily like some cunning automaton of lever and cog, and indeed agony was stripping him of thought and feeling. He hardly noticed when the icy fall water splashed across him, when his feet and fingers began to slip, when at last they slid free and he fell into air. A moment free from pain was almost as agonizing in its suddenness. Then came the kiss of soft snow and the jarring slam of the stone beneath. But it was mild, bearable compared to what had passed, and he lay there laughing weakly until Rock and Kermorven had made Ilse safe and hurried to help him up. At least you'd only a step or two to go, said Rock, as they dusted him off. Elof did not tell him that for all he had known then, or cared, it could have been 1 or 100. He had been at the end of his strength, but the moment he was free of the ice, it returned to him very quickly. They had come down upon a rockfall like the rest, but less steep and unstable. The stream chattered away among the heaps of snow-clad rock, and they decided to follow its course downward. Across the snowfield it led them, and at last out of the lowering shadow of the ice cliffs above. It was only then, on the brink of a long slope, they turned and looked back. Ilse tore the bandage from her bloodshot eyes and gazed with the rest upon the bulwark and rampart of their foe. In looming heights of strength, dazzling as gilded steel in the light of the sinking sun, Those cliffs arose across the skies of the ruined land of Morven from east to west, unbroken, unbreached, buttressed by immense ridges of fallen rock, whole ranges of rubble hills. A strength and fortress, it seemed, that mere men should not dream of resisting, could not hope to challenge. Yet we passed beneath you, over you, through you, said Kermorven softly. We came back to Morven, and we won free. Free, and with a prize of infinite worth. Then he drew the sword Elof had made him, and cried in a great voice in the two tongues of his folk, Morven Morlenhall, Morven shall rise! Word and blade together sparkled defiance in the free air before those sullen faces of ice and shattered stone. As the last echoes died, he turned the sword gracefully in his hand and slid it back into its scabbard. It is a lord of Morven. It is a lord of Morven tells you, he muttered. Then he turned his face from his lost domain and strode down the slope. The others followed quietly and let him be, and it was not until much later that he spoke again. By that time they had reached the end of the slope. Their little stream joined with another and larger, a black seam of meltwater wavering away through thinner, softer snow, down towards the more level lands below. They followed the larger stream, which was joined by others, and itself flowed into a river of some width. This was still partly frozen over, but now the meltwater below and sun above were swelling it, straining the ice and cracking it into great loose floes that ground and splintered against each other with creaks and crashes and the musical splintering of glass. Along its banks the snow was turning soft and patchy. Here and there plant stems protruded through it, chiefly gnarled patches of willow scrub. On some of these the first soft catkins were appearing, and as the travelers came to one wide thicket, they were startled when a stout white bird flew up almost in their faces, with a sharp, chattering cackle of rebuke. To their surprise, it did not fly off altogether, but flapped heavily to the far side of the thicket and scuttled for cover. Rock cursed. Elof stooped readily for a stone, as he had learned to do on the marshlands, but it was already vanishing into the bushes. Ills blinked and squinted after it. A snow grouse, losing its winter plumage. They never fly far. Good to eat, for they live on willow, not pine, which taints the flesh. That wouldn't have stopped me, said Rock. Courage, said Kermorven. Where there is one, even so close to the ice, there will be others. The more so, as the snow is failing. Next time we shall be ready. And indeed, at the next large clump of willow, in the shadow of a high boulder, they flushed some 4 or 5 of the birds. Into the midst of them hissed Elof's stone, and one dropped in a flurry of feathers. Bravely cast, Kermorven cried, and the others echoed him. He clambered up the boulder and looked down river. And only 1,000 paces or so southward there are trees, he announced, springing lightly down. Shelter and fuel. We have just enough time to reach them ere the light fades. The others groaned, but they knew he was right. The march seemed endless, the twilight long and dreary, with the slushy snow caking around their boots. And when they came at last to the trees, a stand of windswept evergreens hunched above the snow, they found little enough comfort there. But it was something to be among life after so long in a dead realm, to squat in a snowless hollow of the river bank and warm hands at the smoky little flames of a clay oven well hidden in the bank. and never had anything tasted so good as broiled strips of grouse, and the broth they boiled from its tough meat for the morning. "Let us hope it foreshadows better times," said Kermorven, as they curled up against the warmth of the oven. "Sleep now, and I will take the first watch." He smiled grimly at Elof. "May it be briefer than yours, and less disturbed." And indeed, nothing worse came about them that night than a northwest wind whining among the trees, and brief flurries of sleet that were uncomfortable, but not unendurable. When Rock, who had the last watch, woke them, they found the snow already melting in the rising sun. The day that followed was one of sunshine and showers, which seemed hardly any hindrance to them now, and though the land around was often marshy, they came among many more trees. Elof and Kermorven cut themselves saplings and made crude bird bows, which won them 2 more grouse, and later, a large white hare. They smoked some of each as a reserve. Elof, too, discovered some of the marshland roots he remembered, swollen with the stored food that had let them live out the long winter and sprout again, and they carried some of these also. Desolate as it was, this land was kindlier than the eastern marches of the ice. "Which should be of no surprise," Kermorven reflected over the next day's breakfast, "for it must all once have been the richest grain lands of southern Morven."
"Hard to imagine," said Rock. "This stark plain carpeted from east to west in green shoots, all yellow come harvest. How far south they stretch?"
"I do not know. So little of Morven was preserved. I have seen some rough views of Kermorven the city, drawn from a failing memory and many times recopied, but the rest of the realm I know less of. I do know that the eastern boundary of the king's own lands was a range of mountains, less high than the Meneth Skahas. They marked the boundary over the lands of Morvanic, Morven the Lesser, which was Corentin's princedom. Over those mountains, if anywhere, the outcome of our quest should become clear." Elof looked at the horizon, south and east. There were signs of the land rising a little, turning into rolling country, perhaps, which might eventually give way to low hills. But sight or sign of mountains there were none. He grinned at Kermorven. "A long step, then. I'd no idea your ancestors were so mighty. We'd best be on our way." A long step it was indeed, as the chronicles record it, but a peaceful one. For though the lands they moved through bore the imprint of a cold hand, it seemed to be less strong this far south, as if the ice had overreached itself in the drive to shatter Morven. The earth was not as frozen in these lands as it was in Taonla, nor did the air of death and decay spread across them as it had in the Northland Mountains. Spring here was a muted thing, but life flourished nonetheless, and it was life the travelers knew well, much like that of northern Norderney. They were never again short of food for long. The snow grouse were seldom far away, their plumage changing from pure white to black around the neck, behind their eyes 2 absurd tufts of bright scarlet, with which they made much play in their spring rivalries. Great flights of geese and ducks settled upon every river and lakelet, and hares were common enough. And it was only a few days later that they came across a herd of large deer moving out onto the plain, of exactly the same kind that flourished in the Northlands. Their coats were still in winter gray, and their antlers half-grown and still in velvet. "I wondered what that white brute preyed on," said Kermorven thoughtfully. Probably it had slept out the winter in its deep lair, and awakened to await their return. Other hunters will no doubt be doing the same. We had best be on our guard when the herds are near. At first, though, they encountered nothing save a pack of wolves, scrawny after the long winter, who were more interested in lame deer, hare, and small rodents than men. When Kermorven's bow brought down a young deer, they circled and scurried about, but seemed glad enough to squabble over the stripped carcass and leave the travelers in peace by their fire some way off. But just after dark, as the first of the ice glow climbed up the sky, there came a mighty outcry of yelping and snarling, and a deep, gurgling growl that no wolf ever made. The travelers sprang up and drew their weapons, lest whatever had appeared should turn on them. Silence was as suddenly broken by the pop and crunch of bones, and then a strange beating, swishing sound, the thud of something falling nearer them. Kermorven caught up a blazing brand from the fire and strode forward, the others close behind. Then he stopped so suddenly they barged into him. A patch of blood-soaked mud showed where the deer's carcass had lain, but it was there no longer. Neither were the wolves. There were drag marks in the mud, but they went only a few feet, and the grass around was unbent. Kermorven moved the flames about, and they saw in the mud, still oozing, a single imprint, longer than a man's foot, a great tridentine talon. "There, by the bank!" cried Ilse. Kermorven cursed and swung the torch high, and they all saw what she had glimpsed in the darkness. The remains of the deer, much mangled, lay by the river bank, at the foot of a low, rocky outcrop. Atop this, hissing like quenched iron from gaping jaws, perched a dragon. It flared its wings and reared up at them, short legs tucked in against the serpentine body, the long head outthrust and spitting. But it was a young beast, quarter the size of the ones Elof had first seen, and not yet come to its flame. When Kermorven advanced on it menacingly, it spat at him again, then ducked its head to seize the ragged remains of the deer, threshed clumsily aloft, and wavered away into the night to find some quieter place to enjoy its scavenging.
"A good thing it was no larger,"
said Kermorven, shaken. He tossed the brand back on the fire, and glared at the cold glow in the northern sky. A fond farewell from the ice. In that he spoke more truly than he knew. From that night on, they were no more troubled by strange creatures. As night followed night, and the lands grew warmer, the pale light of those bitter ramparts sank and dwindled beneath the horizon, growing ever fainter until they saw it no more. And it is set down in the chronicles that many long years were yet to pass ere any of them set eyes on their great adversary once more. The deer, and another they took the next day, gave them a good store of meat, which was as well. They encountered no more herds as they walked further to the southeast, following the rivers that ran like dark veins through the rising land. On the 7th day of their journey, they drew at last into higher ground, a hilly country with many long stretches of evergreen forest. Though they viewed it at first with deep suspicion, it seemed younger and more sparse than Taipau-la-Aethan, and like the Northland forests, it wholly lacked the oppressive air of watchfulness. Larger creatures were still scarce here, but there were more birds. Jays screamed, black woodpeckers drummed, swifts shrilled over the treetops, and swooped so low over clear ground that their wingtips hissed among the weeds. 1,000 small flashes of life bounced and chirruped in spring feather through the woods. The sun shone more often now, and the rain, though often hard, released rich scents into the crisp air. Bare though the land was, after the desolations they had been through, they felt they could wish for no better garden. Food had given them back their strength, and only the cold remained to plague them. Yet though they strode ever higher among the hills, it did not greatly increase, save when the wind blasted down upon them from the north, bringing sleet and stinging hail to send them leaping for the nearest large tree. They were content enough to find no worse adversary. Fire warmed them at evening, and they met the next day, the next hill, as they came to it. So it was that they were surprised one bright morning as they left a large area of woodland flanking a chain of broad waterfalls to find that they were already high among the lower hills of the mountains they sought, and that the peak stood clear above them now.
"Such as they are," said Rock scornfully, "hardly mountains at all, are they?"
"Lower than our western ranges," agreed Kermorvan unhappily. "And they run northwest from here. They must meet the ice eventually. A poor barrier." Rock shook his head dolefully.
"Might have just flowed down around the far side."
"Doubt that," observed Elof. "It had to make a great effort to swallow Morven. Nowhere in the Westlands did it come so far south. And to pass round these mountains might be a greater effort yet. They are older than our mountains, I think, and more worn, blunt as old teeth. But they may well be wider." As they climbed higher, finding peak behind peak, and came at last to the mouth of a likely pass, they saw that he was right. Broad as that pass was, with a river at its heart, they could not make out its end. It snaked away among the peaks into the blue distance. "They gain from being lower," said Ilse. "There is snow here, but it is melting as summer comes. There are fewer snowcaps for the ice to seize on."
"That is some hope at least," said Kermorvan. But Corentin did not speak idly. Morvanic was small, its lands thinly peopled and half wild. It could not long withstand any determined onslaught. Still, something may yet endure, and so must we.
The snowy grasslands that flanked the river grew sparse as it climbed the flanks of the pass, and still thinner till at last it dwindled to bare earth. For the first 3 days they saw no life at all, beyond small birds. The snows that had faded on the plains still fell at times, not heavily, but enough to make them use the firewood they had carried from the hills more rapidly than they wished. Elof wondered if their food would last. It was little enough they had now. Yet among their other hardships, it made the vital difference. He could hardly bear the thought of going hungry again. On the morning of the 4th day, when the opening of the pass had vanished behind them, and a low crest limited the view before them, they were surprised to see movement on the riverbank ahead, black specks drifting through the snow-speckled grass. At once they dropped from sight behind stones and scrub. Whatever was about up here should be approached with caution. As Elof and the others sidled closer, keeping behind a huge boulder entangled in willow scrub, he saw that they were beasts, large and four-legged in shape, not unlike small wisents with immensely shaggy black coats. But their short horns, curving low and close to the sides of their blunt heads, suggested sheep or goats. Kermorvan smiled to Ilse. "Some old friends of yours, I think, lady. Among your folk I had occasion to guard a herd or two. Worthy beasts, saved to the nose, she exclaimed in surprise. Velek Imarinen, musk oxen. Now why? She glanced quickly about the barren slopes above and along the pass to the crests. Kermorven was still watching the herd. There is little point in stalking them, I fear. They are cunning and quick, and would not fall easily to 2 mere bird bows. Elof's hammer might do, but it would be hard to get close enough. Ills, what say you? Then he sensed her unease. My lady? At once, he too was scanning the heights, alert and tense. She shook her head grimly. There is nothing there for you to read, Lord of Men. Kermorven evidently noticed the unusual title she gave him, and the dark tones in which she spoke it. His own were guarded but alert. Yet, there is for you, lady? For what it matters, yes. Such signs as we place upon our mountain paths and pastures, that our eyes alone can read, even in what is darkness to you. None clearer, though, than these beasts. Where they are, so also were the Duergar. They are descended from our herds. Here? Your folk dwell here? Elof looked around him with wonder. Rock also, but with more of apprehension. Ill shrugged. The signs are ancient. Only traces remain. And the herds are gone wild. See? She stood up from behind the rock. A long muzzle lifted, lip curled and nostrils flared to taste the air. Another looked up, its shaggy coat twitching nervously, and then long horns tossed in warning. Ills went stumping quite slowly and casually towards the herd, and suddenly they were wheeling about in bellowing disorder and bounding off across the meager grass with a goatish skip that belied their bulk. Out of reach they halted by a wider patch of willow, snorting, suspicious, pawing the ground in threat. You see? Ills tossed back over her shoulder to the others. These have not seen my folk in many a generation. Why do you linger back there? You may walk these lands without fear now, and forget whose they once were. And without another word, she stalked on. Elof and the others exchanged startled glances and hurried after her. Rarely had he heard anything to match the bitterness in her voice. My lady, demanded Kermorven, are you all right? Or how have we distressed you? But he had no answer. She was slow to follow their path, and when Kermorven laid a hand on her shoulder to draw her away, she writhed and slapped it off. She walked with them then, but wreathed in a silence that spoke black fury upon her brow. The others too were silent, for despite her words, they found themselves constantly scanning the skyline for unfriendly eyes. Though they saw nothing, they were glad when near sunset they rounded a sharp bend in the river and saw that the peaks ahead, reddening in the last rays, were much lower. The end of the pass was near. The river they had followed up from the forests came tumbling down here from its sources among the heights. They quitted its cold company for a smaller stream that led away downward a long and winding way between the lower peaks. They camped some way down, in a pocket of rock that would be easy to defend, and built a good fire of scrub. But Ills curtly refused food, and slumped down in a corner. The others gazed at her in some concern. A look Elof could not read had closed over her face like a visor. It reminded him forcibly of how strange she could be, of how alien her stock. He thought of the cold countenances of the Duergar court, of the harshness of old King Andvar, hater of men. He had never seen her look so like them. "Ills," he ventured, "I am sorry that your folk dwell here no longer. Truly sorry. But why should that lead you to shun us so, your friends, when you have come so long a road with us?" She raised dark eyes to him, glittering through the dusk. "And should I not have fled you, as my folk have ever done? You who live and breed so much faster than we? Around half the wide world we have fled, and those who would not, they have stayed and dwindled." Her eyes narrowed as if some new and chilly light shone upon her. Those signs, they were rough, crude scrawls that had all but lost their meaning, the work of near savages. Yet there was a time when no Duergar lived thus. It was new-made savages who drew them. Children of wealth tumbled to the gutter. She gave a bitter little laugh. "Aye, now I have seen whither that road of yours leads. I've seen what we can come to. How great will be our fall when it comes. Aye, when. We cannot flee forever. Before us there is only the Western Ocean, and beyond it the Equesh lands. And so why do I walk with you? Why do I dream of bringing our peoples closer?" There was a dull flame now in her eyes, burning like a low fever. "Will that not simply hasten our last and losing conflict? I think I understand old Andvar a little better now. If we can come to that, should we not indeed shut you out with gulf and stone, and slay all who intrude? If we are doomed in the end, why should I seek to speed it?" She turned away furiously and flung her cloak about her. Elof would have put an arm around her shoulders, but Kermorven drew him back. Concern furrowed his brows, but he shook his head. "Better to leave her be," he said quietly, turning the strips of venison that toasted among the ashes. "She is angry, afraid, as who would not be? But in all she said, I heard only questions. Doubt racks her, not certainty. We shall try to find answers when she is ready to listen. For now, do you let her rest. And when you have eaten, rest yourselves, you and Rock. I shall watch for now." So Elof sought sleep, but the unease of the day seeped into his dreams, which beat and fluttered like great birds caged, or stalked with menace around the margins of waking. It seemed to him that he heard voices speaking of dark things, of war and death and decay, and then turning to higher, yet hardly more hopeful matters. And he knew suddenly that he was awake, although his limbs and body seemed too heavy to move. It was Ilse's crisp voice he heard, and Kermorven's clear answer. "And will it not happen again, wherever men are? More than our shape divides us. The tides of our thoughts flow apart. We can think and live as you do, upon the surface, but into deeper waters few may follow us. Elof, perhaps, and yourself. Rock? No, though at least he would see and respect. But there would always be many others, lesser men who would not see, only resent. And among the Duergar also, I do not doubt. I have met only too many of both races, but if enough of each are willing, it would take scarcely 2 generations. If that is the greatest gulf of all, one that reason is too weak to bridge. A greater force is needed, and you humans are not equal to it. You could not feel as deeply as we. You cannot comprehend our thoughts, still less the passions that speed us on. You would ground on the shallows of your souls.
Would we?
There are some whose thoughts flow deep as your dark mountain streams, aye, and passions also. Look at him. Within him embers are quietly smoldering, ready to burst into flame at a touch of his thought. All this long road they have driven him for love of a girl he has seen in all his life for barely an hour together. There was silence, and Ilse's voice changed when she spoke again. He is more like us, indeed. So, not all men are as cold in heart as I. Ilse snorted in surprise. You? You're no blind fish. Her voice was tinged with gleeful malice. You love all right. The Lady Terrace might have had something to say on the matter, had you but the wit to ask it. I was raised to treat women properly, with respect, with reverence, with spare me. And you love him. It was all too obvious whom she meant. Elof almost sat up in astonished outrage, then struggled to stifle a smile at the strangled sound Kermorven emitted. Not like that. For a moment his voice was a model of stately outrage. Then he collapsed into a rare, rueful chuckle. Elof guessed Ilse had prodded him in the ribs. Oh, I know. The more I struggle, the deeper sinks the barb. I suppose I am fond of him, yes, as I am of Rock. And of you, though Amicak knows why. His voice took on a mild edge of its own. He is a fine fellow, after all. It is not hard to be fond of him, in one way or another. It seemed to me, lady, that even you... Even I? She spat the words out with a force that startled Elof. What would you know of that? As well he does not so much as notice me, him and his damned embers. And you're the man who'd have our races mingle. Can you not see, fool, blindworm, sluggard, how slow either will be to do that? Do you not understand what alone can drive them to such an unheard-of act? We look to each other. We even smell, or we look odd to each other. We even smell odd. To men, you could not look less than fair, lady. Aye, thank you kindly, sir. But fair as one of your own? All willowy and wispy, golden or red, aye, or auburn about the hair, like a certain lady of Liz Arvalin? I take leave to doubt that. To us, long man, you look stretched out like a shadow, weak as a hank of straw, thin as a dribble. No doubt, interrupted Kermorven calmly. So, to awaken feelings, we must look past that, to what is common in us. It can be done. Have we not come to that, in some degree? Ilsa's voice was grudging. Perhaps we have, thrown together in strange circumstance, but others will need some motive to try. In such matters, rulers cannot rule, but leaders may lead, if they can. So long now was the silence ere Kermorven replied that Elof almost lost the fine tether of attention that held him awake. Neither leader nor ruler am I, as I have said ere now. But should things change, princess of the elder folk, shall we not speak more of this? Aye, if I can hold back from laughing. But at least you lighten my mood, Longman, you and he. Look at him, sleeping like the child he is, and within him a force to break the will of a power. Perhaps we should ask his aid, have him weld races as finely as he does metals, mix an alloy of hearts, an amalgam of minds. Perhaps we should, said Kermorven, with no mockery in his voice. Elof heard him shift position and sigh. For now, this child also would sleep, and leave you the remainder of your watch. But think on this night. Remember it well. All that Elof heard then was the faint crackling of the dead embers. Was that truly how they saw him? He had never felt less ready to take flame. And yet, he sought to open his eyes, to search the sky above. But the effort was too great. He felt his mind whirl away into a cavern of blackness. Like foam upon the deep waters of Ilsa's own realm, it swallowed him. But his last fading thought was that there were deeper waters around him yet. Next morning he awoke in a pool of spring sun, much refreshed, and all things seemed so much as usual that Elof viewed his memories with deep suspicion. He could not tell whether or not he had dreamed all or part of what he had heard. Kermorven was his customary calm self. More significantly, perhaps, Il's was also hers, and of yesterday's horrors there was no trace. In the warmer air it was possible to bear washing in the chill stream, and she even sang a merry little song to herself as she splashed about. And though that needed no better explanation, Elof had to fight down a sudden twinge of doubt and confusion. Her feelings for him, his for Kara, Kara's for him. How much did he truly know of any of these? What did he want of any of them? Unreasonable, ridiculous, to wish ills at his heels like a dog, while he pursued, what? A shadow? A girl of a single hour? What did he know of her, save the cold and dangerous chains about her, the creature that held her bound? Why chase after her when right at hand? He could not finish the thought. But nor in the days to come could he throw off a haunting sense of loss, not even in the thoughts of Kara. The warmth of day as the travelers set out lent a new zest to the air and a spring to their steps, and they scrambled down the rocky way as lightly as mountain goats. Not far below, the stream pooled beneath a low ridge between two rounded hills, and spilled over its edge with a noise of muted drums. Up the poolside rocks to the crest the travelers clambered, onto the level shelf beside the low falls, and realized that their view was no longer barred by peak or slope or standing rocks. It was from that ridge they looked there first upon what they had come so far to reach, the ancient eastlands of the land of Bracehall. Elof's first thought was of jewels, emerald, and sapphire. For all the land below him, from the steep slopes that seemed almost to fall away from his feet, to the wide expanses of forest beyond them, to the hint of softer hillsides on the northward horizon and lower, flatter grasslands to the south, all blazed with every shade of green, shifting, changing, glowing in the soft light. Sapphire was the water that flashed and winked among them, deepening the blues it plucked from the sky of lapis behind white clouds. And these also had their reflection upon the land. In the tree-girt basin far beneath the last of the morning mist was gathered, a whiteness purer than the ice, a pool of gleaming milk whipped up by the first breezes into a towering wash of cloud that hung almost level with their eyes, like a sea wave frozen in the moment of breaking. Or like a hand that beckons, breathed Kermorven, poised tense and eager upon the very brink of the rock, as if impatient to follow its behest. His gaze soared like a questing eagle across the verdant land outspread before them. Its rivers sparkled in his eyes, its vibrant life in his voice. See the richness of it. The ice has never touched this place in many a long year. From where it now is, it could send little more than bad weather across these mountains. And near the sea the climes must be warmer, as they are in the west.
Aye, but see also the wildness, chimed in Rock. If the ice hasn't touched it, no more has man. Doesn't look like we'll be finding many Easterners.
There never were many, answered Kermorven calmly. More Vanek was small and upon the sea coast, which must still be beyond our sight. Thither is our goal, to see what, if anything, still remains of it, and if these lands may be lived in. Elof felt a warm, bare arm slip through his and cling tight. It was Ilse, who had no great love of heights and open spaces, and he felt obscurely pleased that she had come to him for support. And after that, we've only to get back home, without ending up stiff or daft by the way, she growled. No small order. But this I can say, we'll not hasten the search by perching on a cliff edge, gawking. They laughed and admitted the justice of that. Yet to Elof, after lush forest and bleak realms of ice, the fair balance and harmony of the view refreshed both eye and spirit. He was loath to leave it so suddenly, as if quitting some spectacle before its climax. He lingered a moment after handing Ilse down, and gazed due eastward, to where the sun shook off the clouds and poured down richness upon the mellow country. A faint flicker held his eye, a black speck amid those streams of molten gold, a shape that swooped against the dazzling distant clouds. Straight into the path of the rising sun he stared, shading his eyes, squinting till dots of color danced and blinded him, and he could see no more. Now Ilse had to help him down, while his sight cleared. "What did you expect, idiot?" she demanded. "Black wings," he muttered, "in the path of the sunrise, as I was bidden. Let us go down now." Their descent led them by the lower slopes of the falls, where already grasses and flowers were burgeoning among the stones, and out at last onto steep slopes where the land's bared bones still thrust up through the thin skin of soil. Yet even here the grass grew ever thicker and lusher, most of all along the leaping streams. They came to a mountain meadow whose grass itself, breast high to Ills, seemed like some deep pool of greenness where fish might swim among the waving stalks. They looked down its slopes to stands of tall trees, and although those around them were almost all evergreen still, they could see the crowns of seasonal trees spreading below, bright with new leaf. Before day's end they were among those trees, a woodland with light and air and running waters, all full of life. Among white pines and balsam firs, gray birch and tall beeches they walked, and found track and trail, heard scurrying and dashing among the mold. Birds fluttered among the trees, fish rose in the deep pools of the streams. There was no need to fear hunger, at least. In so rich a country, they could expect to hunt and fish and snare enough for their needs with little effort and delay. So indeed it proved. Over the days that followed, while they made their way down through the woods to the lower lands beyond, they passed among paper birches, hickories, and elms. They camped one night under massive oaks with green leaves, the next under chestnuts that loomed like stepped towers in the morning mists. Elof could not help missing the great redwoods of his northern woods. Kermorven the tall adders he knew, for those grew here only as large streamside shrubs under the willows and the poplars and quaking aspens, which seemed more common than in the west. It was a long avenue of these poplars that caught Elof's eye some mornings later, silhouetted by sunrise upon the crest of the next hill. He called to the others, and they saw, as he had, that the trees grew strangely regular and separate. After a bolted breakfast, they hurried to investigate, but long before the hill's crest they could see that something lay there. When at last they struggled through the tangled bushes at its edge, the road came as no surprise, save perhaps its width and its state of preservation. The stone slabs that surfaced it were cracked in many places, with grass and other plants thrusting up through the crevices, but so large were they to begin with, and so smooth, that save at the edges, where the poplar roots had been at work, little of the paving was wholly overgrown. "I've seen parts of our high roads in less good repair," exclaimed Elof. "Have men kept it this clear? Or has it lasted?" "No man has passed this way for many long years," said Kermorven, gesturing downhill to where a thorn bush and bramble overhung the path. "This must have been maintained since the fall of Morven, yes. But I would guess it is a beast's track now. Still, seems to lead eastward, and we have no better guide. Let us follow it." The road proved a good guide indeed. Often they had to hack aside overgrowth with sword and axe, but hardened as they were to rougher country, this bothered them little. They made swift progress along its kindly path, and strayed from it only to gather food or bathe in the rivers. Out of the woods it led them at last, winding like a gray stream among grassy hills that might once have been rich pasture land, and out onto a raised bank across a wide plain. It seemed as if only spring grasses grew and tossed here now, but Kermorven, plucking the heads from many, found that they were grains grown once by men, and now sunk back among grasses and tares, he muttered, kicking at a weathered hummock by the roadside. See, here sat the boundary stone of a field, and somewhere nearby there would have been a farmhouse, a village even. Over there, perhaps, that low mound where the road turns for no reason. They gazed at it in silence as they passed.
How long such a place lie forgotten to come to that?
Rock wondered. 500 years, maybe, said Ilse, or twice that. It must have been left long before the fields ceased to be cultivated.
It was indeed, said Kermorven darkly. For this must have been land farmed by the Southrons who fled west to found Kerbrahine. Those who stayed must have kept up the land.
His words tailed off, but Elof had read his thoughts, and could not help but voice it. Kept it up until there were so few that they could not, or they no longer needed its produce. And they maintained the road, which must have led over the mountains to Morven, till it was clear that none would return that way.
Till now,
Kermorven barked, his face gone all to edged flint.
We have come back, and few or many, they will know that we are the heralds of a new time.
For many more peaceful days the road led them on. Into woodland it wound again, sparser now and with few evergreens, and the air grew warmer, milder, with every day that passed. The woods straggled out through low, hilly country where among good but empty pasture land the ruined stone circles of cot and fold gaped like empty eyes, and still no man stirred. As the days went by, Elof began to believe that he could smell the sea upon the breezes, and soon Kermorven was agreeing with him. They found that the road seemed in better repair, and beside it they came upon ruins that still stood, a lone wall, 3 walls and a gable, 4 walls and half a roof sunken askew between them. On a night of rain, they sought shelter in one such ruin, displacing only owl and bat from its hollow rooms.
Here, remember the places we camped in, by the high roads?
Chuckled Rock.
Seems a lifetime past, yet it could just about be the same.
Not quite, said Kermorven seriously. Whatever reduced this and the others, it was not war as such. They have not been sacked or burned, simply left, neglected, and not for very long to be still standing thus. 50, 60 years perhaps, certainly less than 100. So recent? Asked Ills. And all of them? All abandoned at once? Kermorven's mouth twisted. They look about the same age. Not a comforting thought, is it? That there were folk here until so few years ago, and then none. There could be many reasons for it. Few good, most ill. But the sea cannot be so very distant, and there we will find at least part of our answer. He turned over then on his bed of cut brushwood and went peacefully to sleep.
Aye,
muttered Rock.
Always providing it doesn't find us first.
It was no more than a day or two later, as the tales are told, that the road led the travelers up a steep slope of the land and into a patch of thick woodland that Kermorven guessed had been cultivated as a windbreak for fields beyond. They found the truth of his words in the lively breeze that set the boughs to dancing and whipped at their cloaks. And as towards noon they emerged into the open once more, it stung their wide eyes, and yet hardly did they know or care. For the gleam of wide waters under the sun was in them, and more than that. They looked with awe upon the end of their perilous journey, which had lasted from one spring's beginning to another's end, and from one shore to another of all the vast land. Boundless before them, unbroken to the horizon, stretched out now the waters of the Eastern Ocean. These were the seas of the sunrise, over which the fathers of men, founders of the realms of Morven, had first sailed to this land. Far below the horizon, beyond the very curve of the world, these same waters lapped upon the fabled strand from which they had sailed, the shores of Caris. The sight of them in itself was a mighty wonder. Elof's heart leaped to behold again great waters, and to hear, borne faintly over the long miles, the play of their waves like a vast breath upon the shore. Yet it gripped the travelers for a few moments only, as long as it took their sight to resolve out the dazzling light the lands below, and the great hilly promontory, stark against the glittering sea that so dominated them. Such a sight Elof had beheld from afar once before, and it stirred in him now an even greater awe. That ordered landscape, fair and fertile, the checkered pattern of field and orchard and well-tended woodland, these were the marks of the children of Caris upon their new homelands. Nature mastered, but not plundered. Tamed, but not ravaged. But whereas around Kerbrahine the fields had been scarred with fire, enshrouded with the smoke of siege and sack, they stretched out here unmarred from hill to sea. From north to south, as far as his eyes would pierce the hazy air, at least twice as great in their extent, and as greatly as they overmatched the lands around Kerbrahine, so also in the same proportion did the city at their heart. Kerbrahine had seemed to Elof a jewel, a brooch or boss upon that blazon of fields. But this, laid out along that wideness like some ark of the powers come to shore, this distant city was a towering coronet, and it held the eyes of Kermorven as no lesser jewel could have done. It was Ills who spoke first. Kermorven, you did not say that your people had another great city to the east. Or is this the work of some other folk? The tall warrior shook his head. From the sight of it, there is only one place this could be. Does it not sit like a crown upon the cliffs of Alongness? Does it not thrust like a spearhead out into the sea, a mighty sea-wall to shield its own fair harbor? On that same shore that Lord of Caris set foot, who was the first king of all my line, and there he made his first town, from whence his sons were to found Morven the Great. Did we dream ourselves mighty, we of the West? Did we dream we had revived and kept alive the glories of old? His voice shook, but it was a wonder that he could form his words at all. Behold, then, a dreamer has journeyed long to awakening, and found how tawdry was his vision beside the glory that is true, and lives. For do you look now upon Morvanic, Morven the Lesser? In your minds mirror from it the much greater splendor that is past, and mock our child's pretense. I would not make compare, said Elof softly. Kerbrahine is the greatest city of the West, but the West is a realm divided. Two lands that should be one. I would rather see in this what Kerbrahine might have been, had your wise line been its lords. A city of one kin, one blood. The others looked at him and smiled, and only then did he realize how apt was that title. For a city of one blood it might well have been. In the noontide sun, the sand red stone of its far-off walls gleamed warm and ruddy, as if living blood did indeed course through them.
"That's the right of it,"
said Rock.
"and the sooner it turns that way again, the happier we'll be. A right marvel is this place."
"It is," breathed Ills. "Mighty are men, if Morven was greater." Morven nodded gravely, and placed an arm about her shoulder. "But mightier still they will be, if their elders will but stand by their side. Come, it is still a good 4 leagues away at the least. If we hope to reach its gates before nightfall, we must not delay." It was as well they had a smooth road before them, for none of them could long bear to take their eyes from the miraculous city, lest, like some deceiving vision in the wastes of the south, it rippled and vanished into the haze. But as they drew nearer, it grew only clearer and sharper in their eyes, yet still more marvelous. Elof saw now that, like Kerberheim, it had grown and spread gradually outward from the crest of its hills. Many walls that had once been outer walls wove between them, overwhelmed and overtaken by waves of new building in their shadow, until these were walled around in their turn. This Morvanic had not the look of Kerberheim, with that city's chill walls of ivory stone and circles of rooftops in gold grays and greens, its looming citadel a diadem of gold-crowned towers as a cold heart. Here, all the defenses were toward the outside, walls wider and thicker, smooth and seamless, with a very roadway for their parapet, and at every turn and corner a vast round tower, massive and broad-based, smooth-flanked and windowless, save for a gallery with firing slots just beneath the high conical roof. Turrets and gatehouses of the same pattern lined the walls between. "They are strongly shaped, these towers," said Ills, "built less for vainglory and more for use."
"Looks friendlier, all the same."
Ills arched her brows. "But of course. Squat and solid like Duergar, not tall and weedy like men. They're bound to look kinder than those haughty towers of Kerberheim." "The whole city has a warmth to it," said Elof. "A lack of order, you mean," grinned Kermorven. "But I can forgive it that, for what it holds at its heart." He gestured at the crest of its highest hill. There the stone of the cliffs surged up through the circles of the city like the back of some vast sea beast breaking surface, and out of it a vast plinth had been hewn. Great stairs flanked it, and raised above them was a high, straight-walled tower of immediate strength and majesty, that bespoke immense age. Yet this was no grim fortress, blind and commanding, but rather a great hall of many galleries and wide windows, which bore its light fortifications as might a king a crowned helm, chiefly for ceremony, but serviceable at need. "It was said of the city by the waters that you could not walk its width between 2 sunsets. Mused Kermorven. You could cross Kerberheim in half a day. And this place?" Elof squinted to judge the distance. "Midway between, I guess. We see it so clearly only because we are nearer the end of the ness here than its beginning. Happily, there are gates on this side, or we should have a long walk." So much the travelers must then have seen, but there is much more here recorded of that city's aspect that could not have been visible from so far off. Some, no doubt, they saw as they made their way down out of the hills and in among the inland farms, and some perhaps was added later, as is the way of chronicles. But of the immediate impression it made upon them there is no doubt, and the palace most of all. It looked to be of the same red gold stone as the outer walls, but darkened almost to blackness by weather and the smokes of the town beneath. So also were the walls of the inner circle and its lesser buildings. They were of a type, tall and stately, with high-peaked gables under gray slate and columned frontage, built in long rows and facing outward around the hill, outward to sea and sky and land. Many in the circle below were of the same lordly fashion, but some among them glowed in stone of a lighter gold, some in a dark stone with a greenish gloss to it that winked and glittered in the sunlight. And these, where the hill permitted, were laid out in squares or circles with small splashes of greenery at their hearts. And like slender ladies or impudent children, other smaller buildings danced around them. These were not uniform and austere as in the West, but of a merry variety. Gray slates clad the taller rooftops, but the lesser were a cheerful riot of tiles in all colors, red and yellow and blue the commonest, and all manners of glaze and pattern. Their walls were of colored stones, or bricks in many earthen hues. Some were faced with glazed brick, or rendered in dazzling white, or simply painted in many colors. But it was the gaggle of houses in the notch where cliff and wall dipped down together towards the wide harbor that caught Elof's eye. Many of them seemed to be boat-like in wood after the fashion of his own home village, their roofs of scaly wooden tiles, tar-blackened over high-crested gables. Their walls were painted in many colors faded to lightness, and it seemed to him, straining his eyes over the distance, that some bore bright designs, leaping and curling shapes that could be very like the water beast patterns he remembered. "It seems there are seamen here," said Kermorven, "probably of northern stock. But where are their boats?" Rock shaded his eyes.
"There's some masts in the harbor."
Kermorven frowned at the small dark streaks within the great breakwater.
"Indeed, but only a few, and small. Light fishing boats they could be. A city this size should have greater ships than that, if only to bring in produce from fields that stretch as far as these. It would be far cheaper and faster than drawing it by road."
"But are all these fields in use?" Ilse gestured to the ones nearest her, and Elof saw that though they were still clearly hedged off, they had not been cultivated at all for some time. The hedges contained a tangled riot of growth, chiefly weeds.
"Strange,"
muttered Kermorven.
"And no beasts in any field I can see. No sound or movement from the farms. No smoke from the chimneys."
"This is all too like what we found before Kerberheim," said Elof uneasily.
"Yet there was a siege, and here we can see none. We can see is none, nor any other cause. Could it be that their stock has failed, their people dwindled? If so, but the sooner we come there, the sooner we will know. Make haste."
Ancient and noble as Kerberheim was, To Elof now it seemed young against the venerable crag that rose before them, frail and slight against those strong walls, scarred by an age of wind and weather. And though the city below might seem more jumbled and less august, it spoke more truly to him of long ages of life and growth than did the unchanging face of the West.
Perhaps that is so, Kermorven admitted. In the 1,000 years since its foundation, we have striven to keep Kerberheim fair, and so built more or less strictly in the fashion of what has gone before. But this city was where men first dwelt in all these lands. Few buildings, even the palace, could have stood so long. You look upon a city that grew like a living body, that was built and rebuilt over and over again down all the long years. Why do you shiver?
Elof smiled, somewhat shamefacedly. You spoke of years, of the first coming of men to this land. I cannot take them so lightly, seeing them embodied before me. I am a smith, well used to looking deep into the past, delving for ancient learning. Yet even I am awed by the passage of 5,000 years. Kermorven's eyes gleamed. And the last 1,000 wholly apart, alone as we were. I believe these last strong walls could be no older than that, and many of these buildings also, as if the city was swelled then by refugees. Will they have changed, I wonder? Do men of southern and northern kindred dwell together still as they did in Morven? Who rules here, since Corrington was lost to them and had no heir? 1,000 questions await answer. Rock shook his head.
But the first one's got to be whether or not they shoot at strangers, even ones that might be kin or king.
I had considered that. Best we make ourselves known at first only as men of the West. Call me Kermorven still, but not by my given name.
A rush and whistle cut the air. He had already dropped to a fighting crouch, his sword half drawn in a single fluid move, before the arrow struck into the ground at his feet. But then he stood and moved no more. Ilse cursed and snatched her axe. Then, like Kermorven, she stopped, frozen as she was. Elof's hand was on his sword, but he too made no move to draw. He also had seen the hedges stirring along the other side from whence the arrow had come. They were outflanked by a band of unknown number, and they might all have bows. Behind he heard Rock breathing heavily, and his muttered words.
Rush 'em. Fight 'em like we did before.
No, breathed Elof. Hold your hand. Morven is right. We have not come all this way to our lost kin only to slay or be slain by them, have we? Rock snapped his fingers.
Well...
But there he stopped, for he too had heard Ilse's strangled cry. He stared with the others at that arrow, and saw that the fletches it bore were striped in black and white. And out from behind the hedge, that perfect ambush, there arose a dozen tall warriors of the Eqwesh, bows in hand. Elof's fingers convulsed upon his hilt. There was nothing he could do save think this was a bad dream. Yet there they were, as he had first struggled against them when they took his village. as he had last seen them at the ambush in the wood. Tall men in armor of stiffened black leather, faces writhing with citrusized serpent markings and the scars of war. The bows were very steady in their hands. They would not miss. There was a sudden hiss and whirl above, and next moment Elof was enveloped in damp rope, foul with fish scales and salt. A net had been cast over them, and even as Elof struggled to draw and slash at it, dark shapes rushed up and seized his arms. From then on, the tussle was without hope, though he fought and struggled for his pride's sake. At last he was bound and tied and lay threshing, hearing other sounds of struggle only a foot or two away, unable to see or help. A ghastly, gargling shriek chilled him, and the sound of threshing in the dust. But at last the net was plucked from him, and a hard, brown hand hauled him to his knees. He looked up and had a terrible shock, for the face above him was too much like the old chieftain who had so nearly had him slaughtered. The likeness was of type. This was quite a young man, grinning through filed teeth.
"Ora, we have you."
He slapped one of their great copper-edged clubs into his palm.
"Obey. Much you live. For now. To the city. Go. Yan hono, not die."
Their packs and weapons were plucked from them, given no more than a perfunctory glance, and passed to others to carry. With spearhead and dagger at their kidneys, arms bound, legs hobbled, they were pushed forward along the road as they had been going, towards the sunlit walls ahead. The young warrior caressed the patterns painted upon his breastplate, and grinned again.
"You think we fools not to watch road? Word come. We watch always."
He jerked a thumb at the city of Morvanik.
"This ours now."